Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce to you. He's a friend of mine. Yes, yes, I am. And he goes by the name
Alex.
Whoa. All the way.
On a broader scale, the idea of port forwarding is to allow a user to target a particular server and a particular application on said server from outside of the network. Internally, the idea is simply to target a particular application on a particular server. Right, so what we're going to look at today is port forwarding, what it is, how it works, and so on and so forth. Now, the thing about port forwarding is it's a bit of a hard concept to explain simply, and that's why most people don't understand it. They've never really seen or bothered to read a proper explanation. That being said, it took me a while to work it out when I was first starting out as well. What I want to do is try and make this as easy as possible. I think of a port as an extension behind a standard PABX system. So you've got, say, a switchboard here with an operator. When you want to get to somebody inside the network, any given extension, so we'll say this is Alex, this is Maria, and this is Frank sitting on extensions 1 through 3. You make a call through to the main number, and the switchboard operator puts you through to a specific machine. Now, the idea behind routing and port forwarding is essentially the same. The primary difference is rather than having an operator, you've got a router. In this router, you've got a static path mapped out. So you say, when somebody dials in to 166.244.12.5 and they ask for port 591, it's going to automatically redirect to this person. Now, the main difference I want you to understand here is that each machine can really have more than one extension. So each person can have more than one extension. They can have their desk extension at work, for example, their desk extension at home, and so on and so forth. Internally, it's the same sort of thing. Now that we've gone over that analogy, let's actually take a look at what's going on in real life. On a local machine, you have certain applications running. Now, these applications can be running on one port or many ports. Normally, they run on one particular port. In the case of FileMaker, it runs on a number of ports. Now, the main reason for this is that each of these ports serves a different function and is there to communicate with traffic on a different basis. When you make a connection to IWP, for example, let's say we're on this machine, we open up our web browser, and we're inside the network, and we type 192.168.0.51:591. Now, the :591 is actually saying, okay, take me to this IP address and then send this request to the application sitting on port 591 on that machine. Now, in our case, we've actually got FileMaker IWP sitting on port 591, which is the default port. If I had just opened up the browser and typed 192.168.0.51 with an HTTP at the front, that would actually default to port 80 because that's what browsers do. That's why a lot of people don't really know about port numbers, because when you open up a website, you do not normally see a port appended to the address. You'll normally just see www.google.com with an HTTP in front of it, or any website like that. Now, again, the main thing to note there is that it is actually making a query to Google on a specific port number, and that specific port number is the default web port, which is 80. Okay, so internally we've got that happening. Now, what happens when you make this request externally? So say we're on an entirely different network here. We make this call to this router, 166.244.12.5, and we just want a website. So we're just going to make a request on port 80. So we typed in HTTP 166.244.12.5. And what happens when it actually hits the router? When it hits the router looks in its little port forwarding table. So we're on port 80. It looks for a rule that says send all port 80 traffic to a particular box. And we've got a rule in there that says all incoming port 80 traffic should go to 192.168.0.51. On this box, we then have a web server sitting on port 80. So the traffic comes in on port 80. Internally, it's still sitting on the same port, and it hits this box also on port 80. Now this is actually important because the router can also translate external ports to internal ports. So you could make a request on port 80, and this can actually make a translation to port 591. So you type in HTTP 166.244.12.5. The router can actually make a translation before it sends a request to this machine to say, make the request on port 591. What's going to happen is it's going to substitute that value in the packet. It's going to run through here and hit this box on port 591. 591 is obviously the IWP port. This box will process as appropriate and send the response back. Out here, we're going to get the output processed by the FileMaker IWP application. Okay, so the packet flows from you to the target router. The target router looks in its little IP table, its little port forwarding table. Here we've hit this router on port 80. It says, okay, port 80, send this traffic to IP 192.168.0.51. We'll ignore this real port thing, which was that port translation I spoke about before. We'll just say port 80 is sent to port 80 on 192.168.0.51. So that traffic flows through to the server and is directed to port 80, which is the web server, which translates the response and sends it back. Now, you can have different port numbers pointing to the same machine. So you could have port 591 also being directed to 192.168.0.51. Now, that would mean that you could access both FileMaker IWP and the web server externally without any issues.